and I'm a open and affordable educational resources librarian at Penn State and a visiting program officer for open education leadership with Spark's open education team. So for a little background before we get started on who we are, the Open Education is a new organization launched, the Open Education Association is a new organization launched in 2025. That's laying the groundwork for a coordinated and sustainable future for open education by building systems, relationships, and programs that strengthen collaboration and expand access to knowledge for all. This is an individual membership organization if you haven't heard of us before. So we encourage you to visit our website, opened.org, to access all of our upcoming events, our published community resources that already exist, and to learn more about how to become a member. And Aisha will put some links in the chat so you can find them. So for today's 90-minute webinar on accessibility, we're going to clarify what the new requirements for accessibility mean in practice. We're going to address common misconceptions, and we're also going to explore how to advocate for OER for greater accessibility and teaching and learning. And this session is going to include a high-level overview of OER and accessibility by Amanda Larson. It's also going to include an expert panel discussion, and I'll introduce all those panelists when we get there. And we have time for informal discussion among attendees if you're able to stay past the hour. As you already saw, the webinar is being recorded. It'll be shared with everyone that registered, and it will be posted to opened.org. So let's get started. I'm happy to welcome Amanda Larson as our presenter today. Amanda is the Affordable Educational Resources Initiative Program Coordinator at The Ohio State University, and she has so much good stuff to share with us, so I don't want to cut any more into her time. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. If you can give me a thumbs up before you disappear that you can see my slides, I would appreciate it.
You're good.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, if you aren't here for OER and Title II accessibility compliance, separating myths from facts, that's what you're getting. So today's agenda is I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. Who am I? Why am I talking about this? Then we're going to go into a high-level accessibility overview. We're going to do some myth busting together. And then I have pulled out some common questions that I have been getting or that you might receive. And then we'll switch over to that panel discussion and then the informal discussion where everybody can chat about accessibility and OER. So into the introduction. Hey, everybody. In addition to what Christina shared, I am a nationally recognized leader in open pedagogy and open education. My portfolio specifically includes providing accessibility first mindset training for the people that I work with, as well as doing remediation for OER at Ohio State using Pressbooks. In addition to that, I support open pedagogy projects and teach students and instructors best practices for accessibility in those projects so that when it's published openly, it is accessible. So we're going to dive right into a high-level accessibility overview, and we're going to try not to get too into the weeds. But starting with, why does this matter? Disability in the United States. So the National Center for Education Statistics reports that at least 21% of undergraduates report having a disability. We know that that number is probably much higher because a lot of people don't report. The CDC reports that 70 million adult Americans have disclosed having a disability in the 2022 Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and that would break down into 1 in 4 adults in America. 100% of people will be disabled at some point in their life. And that disability could be situational, it could be temporary, or it could be permanent. So for example, if I didn't have access to glasses and contacts, I literally couldn't see more than like 6 inches in front of my face. And there are certain things that are happening in my life, like my wrist is acting up, and so it's very hard to do work sometimes, and that in itself can be a disability. You could break a bone. There are lots of ways in which we will all be disabled at some point in our life. So what's going on? Why are we talking about this today? The Department of Justice issued additional rules under their Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act that requires all public entities, including colleges and universities, to ensure that all digital content complies with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, known as WCAG, 2.1 AA standards. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But what does that mean? So that means that it applies to websites, apps, course materials, social media accounts, and other digital content. And the goal is to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. So why are folks panicking? Because it is now nearly the middle of February, and for a lot of folks, the deadline is April 24th of 2026. So all of the materials must be remediated by that deadline for public schools, community colleges, and public universities that have populations over 50,000 or more persons. So at Ohio State, we have an undergraduate enrollment of like 60,000 plus. So that's definitely our deadline. And for institutions under 49,000 persons, that deadline is April 26th of 2027. So what is there to panic about? There are extremely limited exceptions to these guidelines. The first is archived web content. And they have very explicit definitions about what counts as archived web content and how content is being used. Content posted by a third party, where the third party is not posting due to contractual licensing or other arrangements with the public entity. So, what does that mean? That means that you can't control people who come and post comments on your webpage or on your social media platforms. And so you're not responsible for those third party people. However, you are responsible for ones that you are contracting with. So, if you've hired somebody to do work for you, whether it's a third party or not, their work needs to be accessible. Pre-existing conventional documents, password protected documents for specific individuals, and social media posts that were made prior to the compliance date would not have to meet these guidelines. There's also the cost and labor of accessibility remediation for materials. Oh, skipped ahead. Let's go back. Hang on a second. That was wild. Here we go. So there's the time to do the work, is a huge cost. It was a wild jump, wasn't it, Jeff? The labor needs to be done to complete this work across a whole institution, so that's a lot of moving parts. And then the cost to hire more accessibility coordinators, if that's even possible. And the cost to contract out remediation work. So who could you hire? Like what third party company could they possibly hire to do this work? And then also cost to sort of the accessibility ecosystem. So this is a huge burden on the accessibility ecosystem. There's only so many accessibility experts, and there are a lot of institutions who have to do this labor all at the same time. So there's a lot of competing priorities. And then also fear of litigation. These new regulations do make it easier for individuals to sue institutions for not having accessible content. So, whoa, let's slow down. Don't worry, there's no need to panic. We're going to keep calm and remediate on. So, what is WCAG? So, WCAG is a set of recommendations for creating accessible digital materials. They're developed by an international standards organization, the W3C. It focuses on all users having access to the same information and functionality for digital materials. And then there are specific requirements that are listed through a set of criteria. As you can see in sort of the bullseye graphic, in the center is level A, and then it goes out to level AA and then AAA. So what does that mean, these three levels of WCAG criteria? So first, let's start about how it works. So their internationally recognized web accessibility standard is based on four principles, often referred to as POUR. So first is perceivable. Content must be presented in ways that all users can perceive. So this is thinking about how we handle text alternatives for images in particular. Operable, users have to be able to navigate the site via various methods. Example is keyboard or voice. So like you might be going through a Google slide deck like I just did very recently, and you'd want to tab through the slide to make sure that that content appears in the correct order that a screen reader would read it in. Understandable, the content should be an interaction, so should be clear and intuitive to navigate. And robust, the content must work reliably with current and future assistive technologies. So we should be testing our content with assistive technologies to make sure that everybody can use it. So compliance levels, there are three. A is basic accessibility, and this is not sufficient for Title II ADA compliance now. The second is a double A, the required level for compliance that ensures accessibility for most assistive technologies. And then triple A is the highest standard. And while it's not required, we really should be striving for triple A whenever possible. So, what are some of the criteria that we should be thinking about when we're designing content or remediating content? Documents and digital content should have hierarchical headings that are used to structure content. And this is really important because that's how a screen reader will navigate through that content. We want to make sure that there's sufficient space between the lines of text. So for example, for all of the bullet points inside of this presentation, I went through and made sure there was additional spacing so that it was easier to read and wasn't just a clump of text. Text can be resized without losing readability. So that means that when you're accessing a website, you can zoom in and out and it reformats itself to be the size it needs for your screen, also known as responsive text. The text is machine readable, so not an image. So we're not taking pictures, screenshots of text without making that machine readable somewhere on the same page. There's sufficient color contrast for all page elements. We want to make sure that we aren't making sure that the text fades into the background. So we have really great context here with white on black. Alternative text is provided for images, and we want to make sure that we're finding best practices for that. So decorative images aren't marked so that screen readers skip them, and then the alternative text is concise and describes the image. Captions and or transcripts are available for all media, and there's a lot of different specialities that you can get into with that we will not be getting into today. So why are these guidelines more complicated for course materials? So if you look at the graphic, it lists easier to remediate at the top and harder to remediate at the bottom, and then starts with websites, then documents, images, podcasts, videos, PowerPoints, and PDFs. So websites, very easy to remediate, are sort of built for like this digital content area. And then we get into PDFs, which can be easy to remediate depending on how they were originally constructed, but can also be very complex to remediate. So institutions, in addition to that, are also wrestling with the volume of content that needs to be remediated, who is responsible for doing that remediation, and then also providing accessibility training and guidance. So we're going to talk a little bit about some myths. We're going to do some myth busting now. So the first myth is that OER are not accessible. This is false. A lot of OER are created through open publishing programs that foster an accessibility first mindset and do a lot of accessibility training as those materials are being created. A lot of OER that are published through these programs have already gone through an accessibility remediation before they're published. And then most OER are in born digital formats, content making them prime candidates to apply web accessibility standards to them throughout the creation process. And the goal really is, as you're creating an OER, you are doing things in a way where things are accessible as you go through the process so that there's not a lot of work on the back end. That doesn't always happen, but most of the time it is happening. So let's talk about what an accessibility first mindset is. Open educational resources are by their nature meant to make education more accessible, both access as in these are free to use for students, and removing sort of that burden and making them available widely and using licenses that allow us to do things to them, but also the accessibility. How does the resource actually work as people use it is really important. So an accessibility first mindset means that OER are designed with the needs of disabled people at the center. So from the start, not as an afterthought. And we're assuming that people who are going to engage with the materials that we are creating have diverse bodies, minds, and communication needs. What can this look like in practice? Planning for OER to be accessible before creation even starts by offering accessibility training and resources to authors. So that can look like inviting your accessibility coordinator to come in and do a presentation on accessibility for people. I have done that in the past. It can also look like providing them with like a document that has guidelines and doing individual training. You could provide them with videos. There's a lot of options to do that accessibility training. So for example, making sure the author understands the basic like structured headings. So in whatever format you're working in, how do you format how do headings work in that format? Making sure that they understand alt text, and why that is necessary and how to do it. Tables are particularly tricky when it comes to accessibility, so making sure that they are first using tables for the reason that a table should be used to give information, and then breaking that down into steps that they can digest as how to make those tables uh, accessible. Contrast is really important. Sometimes folks choose images that have very poor contrast, or they have like a design element that they want and the contrast isn't great. Captioning and creating transcripts before they start authoring is also a great reminder to give them. Also, it's really important to be using universal design for learning principles in both the construction of the OER and in the content. And this helps reduce barriers for everyone. And then creating an accessibility. It also depends on what access of um hold on, my microphone is doing something weird.
Hey,
Let me
Amanda. Yeah,
just
I was just going to pause you. We blipped you for like 20 seconds.
Yeah, let me just check my sound settings
We can hear you now just
real
fine.
quick to make sure that we're in good shape. Okay. All right. It looks like things are okay now.
Yes, you
You can
sound
hear
good.
me okay?
Yep.
All right. Apologies. It's not a good Zoom day, guys. All right. Let me reshare my slides. Reshare, and we'll get back. Okay. So, as I was saying, some types of OER are easier to remediate than others. So, if we're starting with born digital content, that is pretty easy, but PDFs could be tricky. Videos can be tricky, audio can be tricky, and slides are definitely very tricky. And so that definitely changes the level of knowledge that we need. So, but just like publisher materials, it really depends on the format that they were created in. So, for example, OER created in an HTML sort of setting is going to be easier than a PDF. And open licenses and a variety of formats, however, really make it easier for us as end users who are receiving the material to change the material so it can be more accessible in our particular context. And also, some OER include accessibility statements up front so you know sort of what you're getting. And they can describe what accessibility guidelines they meet, what accessibility features they have, what are some of their known accessibility issues, things that they're still working on, what the plan is in the future for remediating those issues. So this is an example of an accessibility statement from a Pressbooks guide. And in these screenshots, what you will see is on the left, an accessibility statement. It starts by explaining what guidelines they use. So in this particular instance, it was Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 AA. And it follows all of the guidelines in their appendix, a checklist for accessibility of the accessibility toolkit. So they have a place where they're getting guidance of what needs to be accessible. And then they also really tell you what is accessible in this. So it has easy navigation. It has accessible vision videos, which means all of their videos have captions. It has accessible images, and they go ahead and they disclose that they have alt text or that if they are decorative, they have been described in this writing text or have empty alternative text fields. And then all of their links are accessible and used to descriptive link text. In the second screenshot, it continues to go on to tell you what file formats are available. And then what known accessibility areas and for improvement are there for improvement. This one currently has no known issues. And then again, what accessibility standards they used. And I've linked that accessibility statement if people want to go take a look at it when the slides are available. So next myth. Faculty think that they can't use OER if the OER won't supply a VPAT. admin are requesting VPATs for everything and think that OER come with them. So I think the first thing that we need to think about is this true or false? This is false. This largely stems from an misunderstanding of what a VPAT is, which I will explain in a moment, and how they're standardly used. So OER typically don't go through a vendor procurement process. So this is really the wrong type of documentation to be looking for. OER can and should be used without a VPAT. You can look for accessibility statements, and you can evaluate the OER with an accessibility auditing tool. One of my favorites I use all the time is from Expert. It allows you to put in the URL of an OER and then audits the content for accessibility and generates a report. I use this in the Pressbooks remediation that I do as sort of a first step. And I really appreciate that it creates a report where it tells me what do I need to fix and how can I fix it, and I can share that report with authors. So what is a VPAT then? So a voluntary product accessibility template is a template containing information regarding how an information and communication technology, ICT, product or service conforms with Section 508 of the United States Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Once completed for a product, it becomes an official document called an accessibility conformance report. So how does that work? Vendors usually hire a third-party company to perform an accessibility audit. While they could do it themselves, that's really frowned upon. We really want an outside entity to be telling us that this product is accessible. That third-party company will then fill out a VPAT and create an ACR for their product. And this can signal their commitment, having this done, that they're committed to accessibility. Government, education, and other organizations then use that ACR or completed VPAT during procurement to readily compare the accessibility of vendor products. So basically, you're putting out a call. Vendors are saying, hey, you could use my tool. Here's my ACR. This is how we're doing accessibility here. And then they can compare those to make a decision. The process can also help vendors identify accessibility gaps inside of their product, which they can then work to remediate. And I've included an example here of HathiTrust. And they do a really excellent job of showing not only what have they been working on, like here's our VPAT, and then this is what were some known issues, and here's a list of how those have been completed. So it gives you a really good idea of how these could be used. Next myth. Linking to anything on the internet is OER, and content on other websites are not our problem when it comes to compliance. False. Uh, the ADA fact sheet makes it clear that this rule applies to the web content that a state or local government provides or makes available. They also define web content as the following. Information and experiences available on the web, like text, images, sounds, videos, and documents. So if you select it now in the guidelines and make it available to your students, you need to make sure it is accessible. Yes, a VPAT is very important to get for a platform. That's sort of the difference, is you would want it for the publishing end of your OER. So if you are working with Pressbooks or Manifold or Scalor or some other program, you would want to see if they had a VPAT for their platform before deciding to use them. That's a great way to start. Next myth. If a resource is on a state OER website, it has already passed all of the ADA compliance and copyright checks. Also false. It's always important for us to evaluate as end users an OER for accessibility, content vet, copyright, and licensing when selecting material for our courses. I have run into all kinds of OER who have like copyrighted images in them that have structured headings that are out of place. And so it's really important to make sure that we're doing our due diligence as practitioners and make sure that the content that we're providing to students is accessible. And the great thing is that the open license often makes it really easy to remediate those things. So moving into common questions. So what kinds of questions might you get asked? So from admin, we might hear, how do OER help us meet the Title II digital accessibility requirements compared to commercial textbooks? That would be a great question to get from admin versus you can't use it because we don't really understand how they work necessarily. So, from course coordinators or selection committees, the people who are making decisions about what textbooks are being used inside of courses, we might ask the question, we might get the question of, do we need a formal review process for OER before it can be used in our courses? Probably that'd be a great idea. I would assume we're doing accessibility checks of all of the content, but that might not be the case. From instructors or our authors, how can we quickly tell that an OER meets accessibility standards? And we can talk to them about doing accessibility audits and what we're looking for those standards. Are they responsible for fixing accessibility issues in OER that they assign? Possibly. They might have an accessibility coordinator who could help them. You might be in a position to help them. It depends on your institutional context. What tools or support exist to help me remediate OER materials? This is a really great thing we could pull together, and we have pulled together for this webinar a great set of resources. And so pointing them to tools where they can do this work is also great. Will the new rules limit my ability to choose free or openly licensed content? Not any more than it would have in the past. We want to make sure that that content is just accessible. From your work colleagues, depending on your institutional context, we might talk about what workflows or partnerships should we build to ensure that accessible OER at scale is happening at our institution. From students, we might be hearing if an OER isn't accessible, who do we contact and how fast can it be fixed? And so what I learned is that Ohio State, all of those complaints go through student life. And so we aren't necessarily even hearing about them unless we're directly involved in a product that's being used. Questions that you might have. Are you responsible for this work? So it really depends on how your institution is handling it. I know at my institution, we have a lot of accessibility coordinators who are now really overworked, and we can ask them questions. They have provided some centralized guidance. So you might ask yourself the question, are you on your own? Do you have that centralized guidance? What resources is the university sharing with instructors? Are they passing the work along to instructors? That's sort of what is happening at Ohio State. And then if that is the case, the next question you might ask is what new skills or knowledge do I need to effectively support accessible OER? So I think that getting a good grasp on the basics of the 2.1 AA criteria is really a great place to start. So you can also get as much accessibility training as you feel as you need, and there's a ton right now that is happening as we're all trying to do this work. And then actually put that into practice. The more you get your hands on and do this work, the more comfortable you're going to be. You don't have to be an expert to do the work. I recommend curating your own accessibility kit by keeping a list of tools that you like and make sense to you. For example, for color contrast, I love the color contrast analyzer. It's a free download, and you can use it on any content really. It has a color picker where you can use an eyedropper tool to pick the foreground and background and see what the contrast level is. And then it immediately tells you if it passes or fails the contrast level. I really appreciate that. And so as you're doing the practice of doing this work, you can sort of build out a little toolkit for yourself. And then you can share those resources that work really well with you, with your audience. And then how do your workflows need to change to effectively support accessible OER? So how does accessibility already fit into the work that you are doing? Is it something that you already do? Are you running a publishing program? Do you have accessibility training as a part of that? It's important that we are updating our guidelines to match the new guidelines. That will help everybody out in the long run. Are you helping instructors adopt OER? Maybe you're not running a program. Maybe you're just helping people identify content. If so, looking for accessibility statements and learning how to do and run a quick accessibility audit on content as part of your practice is a great way of making sure you're sending accessible items in sort of like a curation to them. So that brings us to the end of the high-level overview, and now we're going to transition into the panel portion. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a great presentation, really setting the ground for us for a general level of knowledge, right, about all of this and why it matters and some myths that folks are hearing. So now we're going to turn to our panelists to address additional questions, additional myths that they've seen surfacing in their roles around accessibility. We absolutely welcome you. You all have been using the chat to add any additional questions in the chat. We're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. But just a reminder, there will be time after the panel for informal discussion as well. So in addition to Amanda Larson, for our panel today, we're joined by Elli Constantin. She's the Distance Education Director at Cypress College and the Special AI Advisor for Accessibility for the California Community Colleges. Kayla Parks, Dean of Accessible and Inclusive Education at Portland Community College, and Ryan Randall, Instructional Designer at Ohio State University. So thank you all for being with us today. So I'm going to start us off, and actually, Kayla, everyone's welcome to answer this, but I'm going to kick it to you first. What is one myth? Amanda shared a few, but what is one myth about Title II accessibility, compliance, and OER that you've heard on your campus or in your role?
Yeah, so gosh, there are many, and Amanda did a great job of addressing many of these in the presentation. But I'm going to pick one that's come up recently. It's this idea that if instructors choose commercially produced materials, they're not going to have as much accessibility related work on their plate because the publishers have already taken care of that. And I think that there's actually a couple of myths inside of that one myth. Because one is the idea that commercially produced materials are going to be more accessible than OER, and the other is that there's not still labor to do. And I think in education today, accessibility has to that accessible mindset, that idea that we are engaged in teaching and learning with a really diverse group of learners, different minds, different bodies, different information processing needs, means that as educators, we do have a responsibility to learn about accessible content creation and about accessible meeting facilitation techniques and all of these things. So we don't kind of get out of that responsibility by offloading it or expecting someone else to do that work. And then we don't have that responsibility. So I think, whichever materials are adopted as primary or secondary or additional sources, there's still typically some element of content creation that's on everyone's plate today, I think, in this kind of world we're living in. So that's a myth that you could avoid responsibility for learning accessible content creation techniques and practice them if you adopted materials that were not openly licensed. Yeah.
Thanks, Kayla. Elli or Ryan, do either of you have any myths that you wanted to
Sure.
address?
Yeah. One I hear often is, third-party content. I'm not responsible. Kind of, I think Amanda spoke on, touched on this. That's a big one. That's the one I hear the most. And the law is very crystal clear. If we embed it, we link to it, require it in any manner, it now becomes part of our digital environment. And so now it has to be accessible regardless of whose material it is. So if it's an OER, a publisher, or something on YouTube, something we found online, regardless of who owns it or who created it, it still has to be accessible. So there's this shift now, this mindset shift from like, who created this to, are we delivering this? So that's big. That's a big shift for us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
And I guess I want to throw one more out there. I guess maybe it's a myth, right? But maybe it's just an assumption. And this is probably an OER friendly audience, right? But are there any places where people overestimate what OER can solve in terms of accessibility? Kind of the flip side, right? Of that, like people might think, oh, it's not responsible for third party content, right? OER is the solution. Amanda, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there are things that folks think that like overestimate that like you're still working inside of platforms that have limitations, for example. So like one great example of this is like my when I do an accessibility audit for Pressbooks content, like it often flags ARIA things, and they're things that I can't necessarily edit because of the way that they're built into the platform. They aren't accessible to me necessarily to be able to correct in that sense. And so every time I run a checker on that, it's going to tell me that part's not accessible. And that's working inside of a really great platform that has a commitment to accessibility. And so there are still limitations to the ways that we can make things accessible. Tables are another thing that are very hard to make accessible. You have to make sure that they have table headers, and you have to make sure that you're building them into like in a really specific way inside of the tools that you're doing. So like, for example, inside of Google Slides, they are really hard to make accessible. And so you have to make sure you're making them as simple as possible so that a screen reader can do its best job with it. Um, but I do think that like the way that we license material does make that a little bit easier. We don't have to think about necessarily like, am I infringing on someone's copyright? Um, and it's not an overall solution. And I think the other thing that's really important is like using OER doesn't necessarily make everything a magically checked off. Like we still have to do all of the remediation, we still have to do our due diligence, and we just have better access to being able to do that because of the way that it's licensed.
Thanks, Amanda. And actually, I'm going to segue to Anne Marie's question in the chat since it pings exactly off what you said. Um, can any one of you speak to the part about copyright and remediating accessibility? Specifically, can we legally remediate copyrighted material that doesn't have an open license? And I should finish that. Does it matter that we're doing this for all learners rather than for specific students with documented accessibility needs? So again, that's really a copyright question.
Yeah.
Kayla, go ahead.
This is Kayla. I'm happy to this is actually one of the issues that really drew me to OER in the first place, honestly. I have been someone who's done a lot of remediation work through an individualized accommodation process in the past. And I have teams at our institution who do that work every day still. And it is frustrating because you do have limitations on who can benefit from that labor. So institutions are doing a lot of the same work over and over each term because we do have restrictions on who can benefit. And it's not always possible or easy to share the benefits of the labor. So, when we're talking about a student who has a documented need for accessible materials and there are barriers that are being experienced, the institution absolutely has a responsibility to do that remediation work, to provide those alternate formats, to develop an equally effective alternate access plan if one is needed, and to do that labor, must do it. And we often have user agreements that we need to sign into when we are working with publishers to obtain maybe not even a fully accessible version, but a digital version that we are then working to remediate further. And those user agreements restrict and specifically limit the ability of those improved materials. They have to be restricted to students who have documented the need. And as an authorized entity, we are affirming that we will not be sharing those materials outside of that specific use case. And that is really at its heart one of the most tremendous things about open licensing, I think, is that when we do that labor, because labor must be done. Labor is often something that is just a part of the equation, and the question is who's putting in that labor and who's benefiting from it. And so when we recognize that we can be proactive, that we can do that work to improve the usability of materials on the front end, and then everyone can benefit, you feel better doing it. Versus when that you're doing that work and you're going to be doing it again for a different but very similar situation the next term, and that colleagues will be doing that same work at their institutions. So yes, there are restrictions on who can benefit.
Thanks, Kayla. Elli, I saw you put some things in the chat. Did you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. Just, copyright does not cancel out civil rights requirements. And so, with ADA, that's a civil rights requirement for our institutions. And so it is acceptable under fair use. And, as long as you're not republishing it out, it's typically justified.
Thanks, Ellie. Appreciate that. Kayla, I feel like you spoke to this a little bit, but Ryan, I'm going to kick this next one to you. So, how can we advocate for OER in regards to accessibility?
Yeah, and actually, this is going to dovetail a little bit off of what Kayla was just saying, but about the labor part in particular. So imagine that if it was a closed, copyright protected video, and only the people who had um, documented accommodations were able to get captions or transcripts. Imagine it's a Hollywood movie, but for some reason they didn't have captions or transcripts. Only the people with the documented things could have access to those. We know the actual statistics I've seen fluctuate, but predominantly, like overwhelming majority of people who don't have auditory, um, who don't have hearing problems, they might have auditory processing issues, but an overwhelming majority of people watch captions on things when they're watching them on their phone or sometimes just on streaming video. Those folks, none of them would be able to benefit. It would only strictly be the few students who have documented um, accessibility accommodations, and then also, unless you make sure to keep those transcripts from semester to semester, you might have to be redoing the work. And so one of the great things about OER is the fact that unambiguously, as soon as one person, one institution has done the work of making the accommodations, they can be shared with everybody. So here in Idaho, we can be benefiting from the fact that in North Orange County, Elli's team has already done a great job of doing captions. So as Kayla was saying, the labor needs to be done, but the labor only needs to be done once with OER, and then everybody else can benefit from it. Both the people who have accommodations because they've either had a difficulty for so long that they were diagnosed early and got that through in elementary school, middle school, high school when it was on the state's dime, or they had the individual wealth to be able to go through that process once they were in uh, higher ed. Those folks aren't going to be the only ones who benefit from it. It'll be everybody who either has a new need for accommodation or just newly gets diagnosed and realizes, oh, I actually do have an auditory processing disorder. It's not just that I zone out sometimes. Everybody could benefit if it's OER. So that's one of the things that I think is really great, is that it saves labor and it also reduces all the ambiguity about do we actually have the capacity? Do we have the permissions to do it?
Thanks, Ryan. So that word labor keeps coming up. This is a lot of work. I'd like to hear from each of you, like where in your role or in your view that you have, where are instructional designers, accessibility experts, OER librarians, where are they getting pulled in the most right now in terms of accessibility? And where are they getting caught, stuck? Where's all their time and labor going towards? I guess I should call on somebody. Ryan, you're unmuted, so go ahead.
Yeah. As an instructional designer, what I end up doing a lot is helping people figure out at my institution, strictly the accommodations tend to go through a different team. Disability services is what they're called here. And so that's the sort of one-off thing. For me and for the instructional designers, it's more about open education things. So, hey, here's a table. Can you make the table accessible? Somebody put it in as an image. That's not accessible at all. Can you make it an HTML table? And we can do that. The other thing that we probably even more we get questions about is from a design perspective, how can we include universal design for learning? So that means instead of having to do it once every semester when we find out that a student has this need, and now we've got to scramble to meet that need, instead, how can we just go ahead and design it from the get-go so that if somebody wants to watch the video, that's great. Or if they want to read the transcript, that's also great. And by planning ahead, you have alternate paths through multiple assignments so that students who need to take alternate paths, that's already designed for them. It's sort of the we've made it an elevator, we've made a ramp, we've got stairs. There are multiple paths, choose your pleasure, whatever you need today, as opposed to, oh, we've got to scramble to make sure that we've got something suitable now.
Thanks, Ryan. Elli, from your view, you're in two different roles. What would you? I mean, I know you've spoken on some panels. What's pulling you?
Just catch up at this point. Even though we were, really working under Section 508 and under the, the old version of ADA before the update, I feel like the ADA Title II really has a lot of momentum and teeth, and the scope has expanded, and so a lot of people are like, "Oh, wow, we really need to we need to get on this," So there's a lot of anxiety, and so it's a lot. It's a spectrum. Where do I start? To who's doing this, and at in the California community colleges, faculty are really responsible for their own content, so that's a big load on them. That's a lot of time. So we have that issue as well. But yeah, instructional designers are carrying a lot of this load, and also what's DSPS's job, the disability uh, department versus my job as a faculty, and where does that line, that's very murky and unclear for people. So just first getting that information out, clearing out some of the myths, and
Yeah.
working on developing a foundation and understanding. But it's really on the faculty, and I feel like that's a lot of anxiety and load on the faculty.
Yeah, so it's communicating information, it's communicating responsibility, it's managing people's anxieties around this, especially with the deadline coming up. Thanks, Elli. Kaylee, I saw you had unmuted. Do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I guess I've always been a fan of interdisciplinary approaches in general. I feel like when you have different perspectives informing a process, it's often better. And so when I think about the role of instructional designers and librarians and accessibility teams, I think strategy and proactive communication and coordination, like for the win, it helps because it is overwhelming. And on any given day, any one person feels like they have too much on their plate. I mean, that's just common, that we all have competing demands for our time and our energy. And I think that interdisciplinary approaches that bring together different perspectives and proactively kind of get after things helps it feel a little less frenetic and a little less overwhelming. It still is. Don't get me wrong. It still is, but it helps. And so, I think about like at our institution, I can say that we have worked really hard for a number of years to make it clear that the student-facing team is not just an accommodation machine. Okay. It is not just about meeting compliance in terms of an individual interactive process. It's about being in a position to work directly with people who are impacted by barriers and learning from those barriers so that we can help inform a better tomorrow. And that means partnering with instructional faculty, partnering with instructional design teams, partnering with our library, so that we're actually learning from each one of those individual problem-solving moments and translating it into different training and different strategy to reduce those barriers. And so I think it's unfortunate when the expertise that lives within a student-facing, disability team is isolated and viewed as just specialized kind of other, just for those people who need it. I think that's unfortunate because I think that vantage point is actually really rich in kind of like, learning where the friction is, where the sticky points are, where the rough spots are. And if you can translate that by working closely with instructional design teams and librarians and faculty, that's how you get the most impact from the work you're doing.
Thanks, Kaylee. So all of you, to me, I hear you all alluding to essentially like a cultural shift, a shift in the culture, right, of how we approach these things at universities, which, as we know, is very hard. All colleges, campuses, it's very challenged to change a culture, and there's a lot of pressure right now coming from various things beyond just even this accessibility compliance deadline. But Ellie, I'm going to start you off by this one. So, thinking about the future of OER and accessibility, what would, we're all facing this deadline, so there's this pressure at the moment, but what would doing this well in the open education field look like beyond just meeting this deadline?
I think exactly what you just said, the culture shift. We're going to move from retroactive to proactive, and OER can really be a model for that. So accessibility is built into OER from the start. We're not waiting for a student to complain. We're not retrofitting after the fact, after we've lost some students in the process. We're not waiting for DSS or DSPS to come to us to tell us there's an issue or a complaint down another pathway that we have no idea about. So it's really built in. Accessibility labor that our faculty and staff are taking on is recognized and supported. It's not invisible. That is our time, right? So I think that's part of a success. And anticipating human variability from the start. Our students, somebody posted on here, which I thought was awesome. Our students learn differently now, right? It's not even just about students with disabilities. It's like somebody listening to a lecture on the way to work, commuting, somebody who needs captions on because they just understand better or they learn better, or maybe you have a temporary disability, or maybe you're using your phone, right? Our students learn via a device oftentimes. So just understanding there's so much variability, regardless of the disability, regardless of the documentation, there's just variability in how we learn. And so accommodating for that from the beginning, not waiting for complaints.
Yeah. Thanks, Ellie. Amanda, anything you'd like to add there?
Can you remind me what the question was? I got
Yeah,
lost
no, all good.
in
Like,
chat.
what is this doing? Oh, thank you all for handling the chat. Yes, I realize there's multiple things happening. There's like tech questions and legal questions happening, a lot of questions coming. So, what would doing this well in the open education field look like beyond just meeting the deadline?
I think it really means really taking to heart and internalizing. I'm waiting, saying that my microphone is fluctuating.
Right, we can hear
Okay.
you okay. So yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm like, on my end, it was like, we're switching your microphone. I'm like, okay, hold on. So I think it really means taking to heart and internalizing in the OER that we're creating and in the community at large, sort of like that accessibility first mindset and the principles of UDL, and that we're really trying to build content to those standards. Um, and getting that baseline of like all of our structured headings are taken care of. Like, let's tick off the easy to check off boxes by like maybe templating content for our authors. Like, this is what a structured heading looks like. That's what we do for our open pedagogy projects. We provide students with a structured template for what their chapters look like. And we're like, you can change everything in here, but your structured headings. um, and really, and I think that we're doing that a lot as a community already, but like really making that sort of like our first line of practice is that it is our goal to build accessible materials and to make sure that where we can, we're easing that burden by helping to provide training and connecting people to resources to make sure that the content is accessible at the end. And I think also really holding the vendors that we use inside of the community, so the platforms that we use to publish on, the repositories that we use to host the material that we're using, like making sure that they're also on the same page and we're choosing ones that also sort of have that accessibility first mindset.
Thanks, Amanda. And I love that you mentioned students too, right? Like, I think even, and Ellie is like invisible labor, right? Like recognizing this invisible labor that faculty and instructional designers and disability folks are doing, is part of making labor visible is also educating students, right? About like in their PowerPoints, right? Like, are they using, right, good accessibility practices? I think that's a really important way to kind of carry that forward. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, just one tiny thing I'd add is I think for one thing I'm looking forward to is when OER will know that people are doing it really well is when things like alt text, people envision it the way an instructional designer might, where it's how can I describe this in a way that will help the student pass whatever assessment the student needs to do? Because there's a bunch of ways that you could describe an image that all could be correct or valid, but you describe it differently if it's to help a learner prepare for an exam. And so really making sure that you're not just sort of, a compliance mindset would say, okay, I need to have a description here that's 125 characters or less. Learner or educator mindset would be, how is this really going to help the student? And at what point should I actually just make the very verbose thing I had in my mind instead be a table that every learner could learn from? So figuring out how not to just sort of get past, how not to just meet the deadline, but also to really think of the purpose of what the open educational resource is meant to do.
So purpose, the outcomes, the learners, right? Like all of those things beyond just checking off a box. Thanks,
Yeah.
Ryan. Okay, so I think one more question for the sort of official panel before we move into discussion time. But are there emerging technologies, or in what ways can emerging technologies help streamline OER accessibility, or can we leverage them in some way that can help us? And obviously, AI is constantly being thrown at us. Are there things out there that can help us? Elli, I'm going to send that one to you.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, AI is huge. With the California community colleges, we're doing a lot of trainings on how we can leverage AI to really streamline some of this work, accelerate some of this work, not replace the instructional designers, not replace the content experts, but just help streamline and reduce some of the grunt work associated with accessibility, and really help with proactive design. And so, AI can really help with converting OER materials, PDFs into accessible HTML. We're using that a lot. We're using bots for that. We're using AI to create accessible content pages with, the headings and the all that accessible HTML built in quickly. You still need the content expert to review all this information. AI makes mistakes, but it can streamline a lot of that and accelerate a lot of that. So I put a bunch of different bots that we created using PlayLab through the California Community Colleges in the resource page. So I encourage you all to check that out, play with them. But yeah, it's very promising.
Thanks, Elli. Anyone else have any thoughts on leveraging technology? Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of automated. I'm a real big fan of deterministic technology. So, sort of the input that you have will always lead to the same known output. That's what I love computers doing. So, things that are evaluation tools made for evaluation, I really respect, and I like using those a lot. I also really like using things like, there's a tool called Pandoc. There's a bunch of other similar things, but you can basically put in a very lightly structured thing. It's Markdown is usually the source, and then it will switch to other formats. But it also is a tool that will let you, if it's a well-made Word document, it can make a well-made other document as well. So there are ones, it's not, that one's not particularly an AI tool, but it's one it was originally made by a philosophy professor at Berkeley like 12, 15 years ago, and it's very well known. And people have been improving on it since. It's open source. But yeah, it's one that I like a lot. One caveat I would say about AI tools is I've heard people use them in ways that I would recommend against. Like, for instance, I've heard of somebody generating VPATs with them. And that, in my mind, is a lot like saying, I want to buy a house, so I'm going to generate the housing inspection. I wouldn't buy a house based on a AI generated housing inspection. That sounds like I'm borrowing a load of trouble. So make sure that if you do use AI tools, you know what you're doing with them and who's responsible for what. So just because you have an AI generated thing that's shaped like a VPAT doesn't mean it's a VPAT. So that's just the one really big caveat I'd put.
Thanks, Ryan. Amanda or Kayla, anything you want to add? And I just want to note to everybody that we'll make sure that all these resources that folks have named will be in the link to the resources that we share out.
Yeah, I think it's good to be curious, and I think it's good to be cautious as well in terms of our expectations for what AI can do. I've seen some impressive time-saving workflows, but I've also seen some really questionable, like image descriptions. And I come back to context is key, and an instructor or that instructional design approach of thinking about what is the purpose of this image in this context is really important. And I don't think that AI is always able to make that kind of more nuanced determination of what is actually appropriate. The other thing that I was just going to say is that AI is also making its way into assistive technology. So, for example, a screen reader user may now be able to use the built-in functionality of saying, like, analyze what's on my screen right now and tell me about it. And we don't want to, I think it's good for people to experiment and be curious. How well does this work? But users won't necessarily have anything to compare that against if an instructional design or instructor approach to describing that content isn't in place. And so you can have deviations where someone isn't aware that the description they're getting is not accurate. How do we ensure that there is that kind of safeguard so that people don't end up progressing down a path with a really faulty assumption about the content that they are meant to be studying from and learning from. So it's coming into play both on the production and workflow side of things, but also in the consumption and perception side of things, is what I would say.
Yeah. Thanks, Kayla. So really that need for that human to review that, right? And make sure it's fitting the needs of yeah. Go ahead, Amanda.
That was exactly what I was going to say. Is
Oh,
that,
sorry,
like,
Amanda.
all things when it comes to AI is that we want there to be a human in the loop. And that, like, AI works best when you have a content expert doing a thing where they can use their expertise to make sure that the content is factual and good to go. Like, you can't take the human out of that equation. When you do, that's when we get hallucinations that get published places and weirdness, is because somebody's not doing that extra step of due diligence. Like, sure, we need to do a lot of things really fast and in bulk. That deadline is coming very quickly, but, like, we still need human people to make decisions about whether that is the right, like, correct option to be using. And again, it loops back around into, like, making sure that we are really centering student learning in that space and being transparent about how we're using those things so students can also see and understand. Like, modeling is really important. And I had a great interaction with a student who didn't really have any of this click for them until they went into a classroom and had to sit at a left-handed desk. And they're like, oh, this is really uncomfortable and this is really hard to use. And so we talked about, like, that's why we picked a classroom that had really accessible seating. Like, you can use this from either direction. And having those kind of conversations with students really helps drive that conversation of, like, they also need to make their content accessible. And they're using AI tools in ways that we aren't using them as professionals. So, like, being able to have those conversations with them in that space is also really helpful around accessibility.
Thanks, Amanda. It's a great way to wrap us up for the panel part of this. Really appreciate everyone's thoughts on this, all you panelists for sharing your expertise and your experiences that you're having around this. So I'm going to kind of quote unquote close out the panel. Thank you all for joining today. It's a little over an hour, and we'll share out the resources that we have. Amanda's already put a link to her slide deck in the chat, but we will share that out as well with an email. We're going to turn off the recording when I finish talking, but I want to thank Amanda for a wonderful presentation, and to Amanda, Elli, Kayla, and Ryan for sharing on this panel. We will share the recording as well. And so if you need to go, please feel free to hop off. But if you're able to stay on and would like to just have, I know there's been a bunch of questions in the chat, people answering back and forth, some things I don't even understand what you're asking about. But if you want to stay on and have some more questions answered or just discuss, please feel free to stay on. We'll just give everybody a second to kind of stop the recording, Aisha, and transition over to the informal part.